Okay, so let's talk about architecture decision records. Mark Richards and Neil Ford wrote, "One of the core expectations of an architect is to make architecture decisions." Remember our conversation about how to architect in 5 easy steps? Let's run through that again. Number 1, collaborate with a requirements engineer to identify the behavioral requirements. This is the stuff that provides value to our customers. Number 2, identify and document the architecturally significant requirements, or ASRs. That includes the behavioral requirements that affect the architecture, but also the necessary quality attribute requirements and constraints. Number 3, collaborate with your testers to define test cases, automated tests, and fitness functions. This enables development teams to actually verify the architecture quality of your system. And number 4, compare your viable options. This involves doing a comparative analysis of feasible technical approaches that can meet all of the behavioral and architecturally significant requirements. And number 5, make a decision and document it. And this is where architecture decision records come in. Again, Mark Richards and Neil Ford wrote, "Making architectural decisions involves gathering enough relevant information, justifying the decision, documenting the decision, and effectively communicating that decision to the right stakeholders." Architecture decision records, or ADRs, help us to do just that. Okay, so what is an ADR? Architecture decision records, or ADRs, were designed to be an effective way to document architecture decisions. They aren't supposed to be complicated. In fact, the more concise, the better. A single ADR should be scoped to a single architectural decision. You could write up an ADR in a sophisticated, rich text editor with splashy embedded images, or more simply, you could just type one up in a little TXT file. This explains the popularity of the Plant UML markup language. It's not so important how you create an ADR as much as it is that you just actually do it. Failure to document architecture decisions gets really expensive in the long run. Functionality erodes, architectural quality drifts. Michael Nygaard came up with the idea of using a basic ADR template back in 2011, and funny enough, he published his idea as an ADR. He proposed that ADRs consist of 5 main sections: a title, status, context, the actual decision, and its consequences. Mark Richards and Neil Ford expanded on this template in their book, Fundamentals of Software Architecture. They suggested that we add a compliance section and a notes section. I'll get to why that's a good idea in a bit. All said, they figured out the simple truth. If you make something difficult to do, people aren't going to want to do it. And so ADRs, by design, are simple. Okay, so let's get to the juicy bits and break down what each section of an ADR is good for. Title. For my money, the title is probably the most important part of the document. I want to be able to cross my eyes and step back a few feet, stare at the screen, and know exactly what decision you've made. Truth is, most people are going to only read the title. Ever. People are busy.
A good title is a short phrase that describes the decision.
Something like, "Use Entity Framework's Code-First method for data migration," or "Use AWS's Textract service for OCR." A not-so-good title would be a description of the problem, or something even more ambiguous like, "Figure out how to migrate data," or "Hybrid deployment model." These are confusing titles. Don't make me think. Time is money. Traditionally, we like to prefix the title with ADR, maybe a decision record number, and a colon. That tells me first thing what kind of document it is that I'm looking at. It's especially helpful when the document repository is full of other document types as well. Including a decision record number is useful, especially since ADRs enable small iterative decisions to be made. Numbering makes it easy to see the history at a glance. Status. The ADR status is a mechanism for driving communication and accountability within your organization's processes. There's no rigid industry-wide standard for statuses, but here's some suggestions. Draft. This is more of a pseudo-status. Usually the rough draft of an ADR can be kept private, unless the author wants to collaborate or get early feedback. That said, if the author really wants to solicit feedback, then it's probably a better idea for them to create a separate RFC. For example, a comparative analysis RFC would be good to evaluate alternatives, and then the ADR would be proposed to communicate the decision that came out of that comparative analysis. Proposed. The author sets the status to proposed when they're ready to send the ADR out for review. Because architects are accountable for the decisions they're making, it's a good idea for big impact decisions to have some oversight, maybe from a lead architect or a review board. Less arduous reviews are probably needed for low impact decisions. Commenting on a proposed ADR should be limited for the purpose of providing clarity. Remember, ADRs are a form of communication, and good communication includes perception checking. Accepted. We move the status to accepted when the approver, that's the lead architect or review board, gives the thumbs up. As soon as the development team is ready to go, they can start implementing the decision published in an accepted ADR. The acceptance process for an ADR is meant to be quick. Either it gets accepted or it don't. And if it don't, then it's a good idea to redraft the ADR or get rid of it entirely. If this newly accepted ADR was drafted to supersede another, we'll want to point to the old ADR that it replaces. Superseded. In an agile development environment, we want to encourage a fail-fast philosophy. That means we should lean towards making efficient, informed decisions rather than getting stuck in analysis paralysis. And that means getting comfortable with the idea that we might make a few bad decisions. The sooner a team can start implementing and validating the quality of your decisions, the sooner we can iterate and bust out some new ADRs that supersede the old ones. In which case, we simply mark the status of the old ADR as superseded and point to the newly accepted one. Withdrawn. If you like to keep rejected ideas around for posterity, you could use a withdrawn status. You could use this to filter the rejected ADRs out of the list, kind of like a soft delete. That said, I'd personally much rather just delete unused ADRs. There's plenty enough noise in the world with all the other kind of documentation floating around. Context. The context section of an ADR should be short and sweet, with just enough information to describe why you've decided to create an ADR in the first place. What's the actual problem you're trying to solve? Some problems are easier to describe than others, so your mileage may vary. Optionally, it can be a good idea to include a diagram that illustrates the issue. Ideally, you want to limit the scope of your diagram to emphasize only the parts of the application or system that'll be affected. We like diagrams. A picture's worth 1,000 words, and we can scan through one with much less effort than reading a wall of text. Remember, the goal is to effectively communicate and get accepted decisions to the teams as quickly as possible. It might be tempting to include more background information. Sometimes we want to give visibility to other options we've considered. But if this information doesn't really bring us closer to communicating our decisions more effectively, then it's probably better to keep it out of the way. Maybe copy it into a supplemental document or even to an RFC. That said, if a little more detail is somewhat useful, you could always tuck it away under the notes section at the bottom of the document. Decision. This next section has two parts: a declaration of the decision and the justification for the decision. Since the declaration of the decision is the most important part of the ADR, you should write it as directly and bluntly as possible, in plain English. Avoid phrases like maybe or I think. I know, in polite society, we're taught to be gentle with our words, but in this case, it only adds uncertainty and ambiguity. Team members are going to reach out and ask for clarity, and that takes time. Again, an optional diagram illustrating your intentions can be added here. It too should be limited in scope, emphasizing the parts of the application or system being affected. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Equally important is the business and technical justification. This is where you explain why you made this particular decision. Even if it's the wrong decision, Documenting why you made it helps us to get to a better place later on. Reverse engineering the technical details of an implementation is fairly easy, but figuring out why you did something the way you did it, it's hard, especially after some time's passed. It's best to capture this information while you have it fresh on your mind. Additionally, documenting the justification is invaluable for future developers and architects. It's easy to want to rip out this thing or that in a system during a big refactoring effort, and without knowing why the architecture is the way it is, they might inadvertently reintroduce old problems. Consequences. As we like to say again and again, there's no such thing as a bad architecture, only trade-offs. Every architectural decision has pros and cons. So we should be careful not to rush to a conclusion without being aware of them. Ideally, an architect will make a decision that provides more advantages than disadvantages. This would be a good time to point to a supporting comparative analysis RFC that evaluates the pros and cons of multiple viable technical approaches. Compliance. The compliance section of an ADR is what I'd call a safety net. We know that not every decision is going to be a good one, so we've got to have a way to figure that out as soon as possible. And that allows us to pivot away from a bad decision early to an even better one informed by the lessons learned from our mistakes. So here we want to describe how to measure the effectiveness of our decision. Basically, it's a test, one that can be automated or executed manually. You could even point to one of the test cases or fitness functions defined earlier during the requirements analysis phase. Remember, we've got to be able to define all of our requirements, even the non-functional ones, in a way that's testable and measurable. This is true even for the big architecture decisions. If we write up an ADR that says, "Our system shall remain decoupled from the repository," then we need to come up with a test, preferably automated, that can verify that requirement. This is especially useful because as new functionality comes and goes, we should be able to execute all of our existing tests to ensure that architecture qualities of our system don't slip. Of course, writing and automating tests is real work, so make sure the teams are accounting for this capacity in their planning. Notes. Finally, the notes section is meant to be the everything else section. Maybe you want to use it to affix some metadata that makes it easy to search for this ADR from within your document repository system. Maybe you want to include some additional auditing information. Most likely, you'll use this section to store all the extra information that amounted to noise in the context and decision sections. Maybe you can drop in a link to some related meeting notes. Remember, there's nothing preventing you from adding other supporting sections to this document. Maybe you don't like the idea of having to create separate RFCs to do a comparative analysis of other viable options. You could add an alternatives section. Just be careful not to overload the document. It should be quick to write, quicker to read, and easy to understand. The goal is to expedite the decision-making and communication process. Architecture decision anti-patterns. Okay, let's talk about the common problems that get in the way of effectively communicating your design or other technology decisions. Proper use of ADRs can help architects to overcome these problems. The covering your assets anti-pattern. This anti-pattern occurs when an architect simply avoids or puts off actually making an architecture decision because they're afraid of making the wrong choice. Well, I've got news for you. You're gonna make the wrong choice a lot. And this is why it's important to identify how to test the outcome of your decision. And this is why it's a good idea to start using the consequences section of an ADR. You want to be able to execute those tests as quickly as possible, early in the development lifecycle. This allows you and the team to pivot quickly. You can bust out a new ADR and iterate. That's agile. Now, it's not possible for all the architects to know all the things. You ain't superhuman. This is why architects have got to stay in touch with the development teams doing the actual work. early feedback is essential. The Groundhog Day anti-pattern. This anti-pattern, named for the Bill Murray movie about reliving the same day over and over again, pops up when we neglect to actually include information about why you made the decision. If you just make a decision and lob it over the wall, people are going to want to talk about it over and over again. So it's a good idea to include the justification for your decision in the decision section of an ADR. This section should include both the technical and business justification. If there's not a business justification, then yagni, you ain't gonna need it. This justification should align with the requirements that you analyzed at the beginning of all of this, but it's likely to also include any constraints or discoveries of new limitations identified in earlier iterations. Email-driven architecture anti-pattern. Email's a pretty great way to communicate, but it's got its shortcomings, and it certainly doesn't make a great document repository. For one, good luck breaking through all that noise of spam, out-of-office notifications, and simulated phishing attacks. And too bad if your company implemented an email retention policy. After 2 years, all that architecture documentation goes bye-bye. More generally speaking, an email-driven architecture anti-pattern describes when people lose, forget, or don't even know a decision's been made. I'd rather call this the water cooler-driven architecture anti-pattern. Have you ever been in a meeting where important decisions are being discussed and you notice that no one's writing anything down? We're lucky if we can recall 20% of any conversation. Good luck recalling all of that information when it becomes time to implement it. That's lizard brain stuff. Check out Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. A big part of being an effective architect is being an effective communicator. That means being aware of the noise that gets in the way of our communication. It means perception checking to ensure that people are getting the message. It means code switching to ensure that if they got the message, they understand it. That's why we want to check in on our audience to make sure they were able to find and understand our architecture decisions. So instead, use a tool that's better suited for storing, versioning, and searching documents. That could be a wiki, GitLab, or something more elaborate like Confluence. We save the email for notifying our audience that the ADR has been published, and the email's got to be short and to the point and include a link. The job of making decisions and documenting them should be considered repo agnostic. If the company changes its corporate tool set next month, we still have a need to make decision records easy to find. Okay, so what about RFCs? ADRs don't replace RFCs or request for comments. RFCs are the conversation. They're meant to help the team analyze requirements, define test cases, compare viable options, and create the transient UML documentation. RFCs, with its comments, help drive collaboration, especially in an environment where team members are distributed all over the globe. Sometimes decisions get communicated in the RFCs, but ADRs should be considered the permanent documentation of those decisions. The collection of ADRs represent the history of those decisions, and that's why we like to number them. There will be times when we have to time box or skip lengthy analysis altogether. In these situations, ADRs are more essential than ever. They capture the context, the decision, and the reason for that decision. They document the risks, the trade-offs, and the guidance for how the team can validate that it was, in fact, a good decision. And although working with RFCs and general analysis altogether can be time-consuming, creating ADRs by design are meant to be quick. I've seen an ADR drafted, proposed, reviewed, and accepted within the span of an hour. If an architect is diligent about reaching out to stakeholders and staying connected with their development teams, then efficient communication is possible. Okay, I'd be remiss if I didn't credit that I got most of this information from a smattering of books that I've read over time. I actually learned about ADRs first from Mark Richards when he came to my organization, and he did a sort of developer to architect seminar. But him and Neil Ford, they collected most of that information in this book, The Fundamentals of Software Architecture. And there's a great chapter on ADRs in this, and that's where a lot of this material came from. But also, you should check out their follow-up book, which is Software Architecture, The Hard Parts. And this is a book that really digs into the trade-offs of architecture decisions. Another book that influenced me was Neil Ford's other book, which is Building Evolutionary Architectures. And he puts an emphasis on defining those fitness functions that enable you to test those architectural considerations. And finally, I call this the big gray book. This is Lynn Bass's book, Software Architecture in Practice. And this is where I learned a lot about, I call it the 5 easy steps of architecture, but it ain't easy. And this book covers a lot of that. So anyway, thank you so much.